In 1933, an ailing Edward Elgar told a friend, "If ever after I'm dead, you hear someone whistling this tune on the Malvern Hills, don't be alarmed, it's only me." Edward Elgar has been described as Worcester's greatest son. Born just 3 miles outside of the city limits, he would go on to spend approximately half of his lifetime here. In Worcester, Elgar found both inspiration and opportunity, and from an early age was a familiar face in the city's bustling musical scene. From humble origins, this tradesman's son would climb to the lofty heights of international renown. But fame and fortune did little to dampen his affection for his roots, and he never forgot the city which had nourished his talents as a young man. Today, Elgar's name can be found across Worcester, immortalised in place names, plaques and statues. But how many of us know the full story of Elgar's relationship with the city? And how much of the Worcester that Elgar knew remains with us today? This is the story of Elgar's Worcester. In 1841, 20-year-old William Henry Elgar moved to Worcester. He had been offered employment as a local piano tuner. A keen musician, he soon integrated himself into the city's vibrant musical scene and took up lodgings in Marl Street, where his local tavern was the Shades Inn. It was here that he met a beautiful young lady named Anne. Anne Greening was the daughter of a Gloucestershire farmer, whose family had moved to the village of Claines just north of Worcester in her youth. Highly intelligent, she possessed a love of nature, poetry, and all things romantic. She and William Henry soon began a courtship. In the archives of the British Library, you can still find a hand-drawn map, which William Henry created, showing the route from Worcester to Anne's family home in Claines. Although the Shades ceased to be in the 20th century, the building which once housed it may still be seen in Marl Street, which retains much of its 19th century character. By 1848, the pair were married. William Henry had gone into business for himself as a piano tuner, and his success meant that the pair could afford a new marital home located at No. 2 College Precincts, in the eastern shadow of Worcester Cathedral. Despite drastic alterations to the area in the 20th century, the slender row of houses where the Elgar family lived still survive. Whilst living here, Anne gave birth to 3 children. Henry John was born in 1848, followed by Lucy Ann in 1852, and then by Susanna Marie in 1854. Life in Worcester was sometimes crowded and unsanitary. The city's population tripled over the course of the 19th century, and outbreaks of disease were relatively frequent. The family therefore decided to move away from the urban setting of Worcester, choosing as their new home the sleepy village of Lower Broadheath, just 3 miles away. Here, the family rented a farm labourer's cottage, set in a rural idyll with a spacious garden. It was into this charming setting that Edward William Elgar was born on June 2nd, 1857. Elgar's eldest sister Lucy recalled the day of his birth. The cottage where Elgar was born and its garden have survived the centuries, and today accommodate a museum dedicated to Elgar's life, founded by his daughter following his death in 1934. Lower Broadheath remained sacred to Elgar's heart for the rest of his life, but in 1859 the family would return to Worcester. On their return, William Henry expanded on his piano tuning business. He and his brother had decided to create their own shop selling musical instruments and paraphernalia. By 1861, the family were living in accommodation above the shop premises, which was located at the top of the high street. It was here that the infant Edward grew to become a young man. Surrounded by sheet music and instruments, it was the perfect environment for an aspiring young musician. Elgar would later recall the shop's effect on him. The shop continued to operate until 1928, but the buildings were sadly lost to development just a few decades later. Today, a plaque commemorates the location of the property. Living back in Worcester, Anne would give birth to 3 more children. In 1859, Frederick Joseph had been born, followed by Francis in 1861, and finally by Helen Agnes in 1864. Sadly, the painful reality of life in Victorian Worcester would soon catch up to the otherwise happy Elgar family. In the midst of city-wide endemics, 2 of the Elgar siblings would have their lives snatched away from them before they had reached adulthood. In 1864, Henry John succumbed to scarlet fever aged just 15. By 1866, Frederick Joseph too had passed away, aged just 7. But for all of the grim reality of life in Victorian Worcester, the ancient city was also an imaginative child's dream playground. Anne Elgar had ensured that her children were raised on romantic tales of Arthurian legends, and the city's medieval streets and architecture allowed for young Edward's imagination to soar. The effects of this can be seen in many of his early compositions. Elgar also made use of the green fields and spaces which surrounded the city, often spending long hours in the summer studying sheet music there. The young boy attended several schools in the city, beginning with number 11 Britannia Square, a leafy development of Georgian properties which survive unaltered today. Here he received his first formal lessons in music. He later attended schools at Spetchley and Lower Wick. In later life, he would recall his daily commute to school, crossing the river via the Cathedral Ferry. The incision of the mythical salmon carved into the medieval Watergate which Elgar describes may still be seen today, though historians now believe it to be the outline of a prize pike caught in the river nearby. The ferry Elgar used to cross the Severn still exists today and operates in the summer months. Elgar's father actively encouraged the young boy's musical progression. He soon invited the lad along with him to play the violin for the local glee club, a social event where men would gather to sing boisterously. The club met at the Crown Hotel in Broad Street, which still exists today. It retains many of the original features that Elgar would have known as a boy. Elgar's childhood friend, Hubert Lester, recalled the scene. Today, the hotel is run by Wetherspoons, but the room where Elgar played violin as a young man is preserved and named in his honour. Elgar left school aged just 15. He was determined to make a career for himself in music, but his parents could not afford the fees to send him to a specialist academy. He instead found himself working in a local solicitor's office located in Sampson Place, where he found himself miserable and unfulfilled. He soon left this posting, determined to drag himself up by his bootstraps. He took on several part-time jobs, including helping in his father's music shop, where he was able to teach himself a wide variety of instruments. As he grew from boy to young man, Elgar's musical talents and style matured. He had joined his father as the violin player in the cathedral orchestra, and by 1879 had received his first commission as a conductor, albeit in an unlikely setting. Worcester County and City Pauper Lunatic Asylum opened its doors to the public in 1852. By modern standards, its 19th century treatments would be considered barbaric, but for its time it was relatively progressive, helping to pioneer early music therapy for its patients. Elgar was appointed to conduct the staff band, who played weekly dances for patients. He remained in his post there for 5 years, all the while honing his skills in composition and conducting. The hospital closed its doors in the late 20th century. Although many of the original buildings were demolished to make way for a new housing estate, some of the administrative blocks remain standing today. The same year he joined the asylum, Elgar had left the family home above his father's shop, taking up lodgings with his sister Susanna in her marital home on Chestnut Walk. The newly independent young man travelled when he could to hear music outside the provincial backwaters of Worcestershire, taking advantage of the city's 2 train stations, which had opened in 1850 and 1860 respectively. In 1885, Elgar took over his father's position as organ master at St George's Roman Catholic Church in Sampson Place. Here, he was able to practice writing spiritual choral works, the forerunners to some of his later masterpieces. The organ, which both Elgar and his father played, is still there today and may be seen and heard. By this time, Elgar had moved in with his other sister, Lucy, residing at No. 4 Field Terrace, just off Bath Road. From here, he advertised himself as a private tutor of violin and piano. In 1886, he took on a new student named Caroline Alice Roberts. She preferred to go simply by Alice. Alice was raised in the upper echelons of Victorian society, being the daughter of a major general. Comparatively, Elgar was the lower middle-class son of a tradesman. Despite this gulf between their social status, the pair soon fell in love and became engaged. They married in 1889 when Elgar was 31 years old. With fame and fortune still eluding him, the couple resolved to move to a new life in London, away from the provincial backwaters of Worcester. At 32 years old, Elgar left the city. It would be another 4 decades before he returned to live here again. Fame and fortune struck in 1899, a decade after Elgar had left the city. Success had come at the turn of the century, when he had produced a number of successive hits, including his Enigma Variations and his Pomp and Circumstance March. During the early years of his fame, Elgar lived in Malvern, just 7 miles west of Worcester. He still frequented the city, where he always found the time to enjoy leisurely pursuits. When he attended Worcestershire County cricket matches, the team's famous New Road ground had only recently been opened. It remains the home of Worcestershire cricket to this day. In 1902, Elgar conducted his choral masterpiece, The Dream of Gerontius, for the first time in Worcester Cathedral. In his youth, he had been a mere member of the orchestra there. Elgar would return frequently for the rest of his life to conduct at the cathedral. The awe-inspiring architecture and acoustics of the building played a huge role in his musical development as a young man. With Elgar having achieved a true and lasting fame, the city which had nurtured his talents now bore him aloft in triumph. During the 1905 Three Choirs Festival, special provision was made in the schedule for a ceremony where he would be awarded the Freedom of Worcester. This took place in the Guildhall's assembly room, which still retains its vibrant interior decor today. Following the ceremony, the party made their way to the cathedral, where Elgar would conduct a performance. Of all the accolades Elgar was awarded in his lifetime, the one that he held most dear was perhaps his freedom of the city. He had left Worcester in relative obscurity, but returned a local and national hero. Over the course of the next 2 decades, Elgar's fame kept him in a near constant state of travel. He moved across the country several times, but he never stopped pining for his native Worcestershire. In 1920, his devoted wife Alice passed away. With her death, his desire to compose also died, and he would never again complete a major work. Adrift in a sea of despair, he began longing for the familiar comforts of his childhood in Worcester, expressed in letters he wrote to friends at the time. In 1923, Elgar moved back closer to the city, renting a large house named Napleton Grange in the village of Kemsey. Here he pursued a life of leisure, and soon became a familiar figure to locals, being seen strolling about the streets or being chauffeured in his motorcar. He was an avid fan of horse racing and became a member of Worcester Race Club, remaining a member right up until his death. He could often be found at the races held at Pitchcroft, and later had a race named in his honour. In 1927, Elgar briefly rented Batton Hall Manor, before moving to a permanent residence in Stratford-upon-Avon. Batton Hall Manor was a large 17th century timber-framed house set amongst ancient medieval farmsteads just within the city limits. Sadly, the manor was demolished in the 20th century, but something of its legacy there can still be enjoyed today. In 1931, he was invited to plant a mulberry tree in the manor grounds by the then owners. Remarkably, this tree continues to thrive today, long after the manor itself has perished. In 1929, Elgar rented a large house on Rainbow Hill, overlooking the city from the east. He quickly fell in love with the place and arranged to purchase it. This was to be his final home, Marl Bank. Here, he envisaged living out his final days in peace. In 1931, Worcester Bridge underwent a programme of widening. This meant that the ornate iron railings on either side of the bridge, which Elgar had known since boyhood, had to be removed. In a fit of nostalgia, he arranged to purchase a length of the railings and had them installed at his gardens at Marl Bank. His friend Billy Reed later recalled the occasion. In late 1933, Elgar underwent investigative surgery, following frequent complaints of back pain. This took place at South Bank Hospital, just off Bath Road, which still operates today. The surgery revealed inoperable cancer of the sciatic nerve, and Elgar was given just weeks to live. He was brought back to Marl Bank and there made as comfortable as possible. The bonds between Elgar and Worcester will always remain strong, expressed in his words and music. Here, his ambition met with opportunity and inspiration, a combination which in time led to his recognition as one of Britain's most celebrated composers. His final days were spent overlooking his beloved city from his lofty perch at Marl Bank. The house was sadly demolished in the 20th century and replaced by a modern block of flats on a terrace known today as Elgar Court. Although Marl Bank is no more, the view Elgar enjoyed in his twilight years remains the same. And it was here on February 23rd in 1934, overlooking the city which had inspired him to compose a lifelong symphony of greatness, that for Elgar, the music stopped.